This chapter is going to discuss real-time imaging, and this is essentially what we do every day with ultrasound today. There is panoramic imaging that we can do with our machines that will mimic the old-time static images, and we'll show you those as we go later. Probably not this chapter. So let's talk about how ultrasound was made a while ago. Okay, this is early, or between the mid to late 1960s to the late 1970s. We had what we called static scanners, and these would show no motion. It was made by having a probe that you dragged across the abdomen of the patient or the body part you were looking for, and creating these static images. So if we wanted to see any kind of motion, we had to utilize what they call M mode, motion mode, to display motion versus time, because the images themselves would not. When we did motion mode with the static scanners, the sonographer put the probe along the line that they wanted to take the motion of and held it there, and then activated the motion mode to show the motion underneath. Today, of course, we have real-time sonography, where we see the images changing as we look at them, and it looks more like a moving picture. And that's where the term cine comes from, is cinematography. So we get the cine loops that we can see over and over. The frames look like the images are changing with the position of our transducer in what we'd say real time. So we move the transducer, the image changes with it. Okay. The ability to show real-time imaging depends entirely on the frame rate that we're utilizing. So we have to be able to create numerous frames each second in order for this to appear as fluid motion over time. So the frame rate is the ability of the system to create numerous frames each second. These are created generally in the range of milliseconds to create one frame of imaging. Generally hundreds of milliseconds, but still within milliseconds. Takes far less time to create one image of ultrasound than it does to blink your eyes. So the frame rate is determined by primarily the propagation speed and depth of imaging. The limiting factor is the propagation speed of the tissues, and the depth of imaging is the what mainly changes from one frame to the next. It also depends on the number of scan lines per frame that you're using and the number of transmit pulses per line. The units for frame rate is hertz, or cycles per second, or in this case it would be frames per second. And this is all what we would call temporal resolution. Okay, how accurate is our imaging with respect to time? So the ability to precisely position moving objects from instant to instant. Okay. If we have good temporal resolution, then we say that if we're displaying many frames per second, we would say that that is good temporal resolution. If we can only display a few frames per second, we would say that that is poor temporal resolution. And that is not necessarily good, because we may miss things underneath the scanning probe if they move past us as the frames are changing. Temporal resolution is the frame rate. So frame rate versus frame time, just as the period versus the frequency, the frame rate is the frames per second, the frame time is the frame period, how long it takes to make the frame. And so we have that these are reciprocals of each other. If you know the amount of time it takes to make the frame, then you know the frequency, because there you just take the reciprocal. Settings that affect the frame rate again are the depth, transmit pulses, and line density. Non-setting things such as the speed of sound and soft tissue, of course, are out of our control. So when we have shallow imaging, we have a very short go return time or transmit echo time, and we can have a very rapid high frame rate. We get better temporal resolution. If we're doing deep imaging, then of course it takes much longer for the sound to get to the reflector and return, and so we have a longer time for frame. This then is a lower frame rate, and we get poorer temporal resolution. So temporal resolution would be measured in frames per second, or to keep consistent with our resolution being smaller is better, the amount of time to create a frame. The smaller that is, the better the temporal resolution. So I'm going to say that again. The amount of time to create the frame period, the smaller that is, the better the temporal resolution. So let's look at how many pulses per image are required to make our images. So if we have multiple foci, and this is known as transmit foci, then you have to send out a pulse for each different focus. Okay. So that's going to increase your line time. If you have a larger sector size, if you widen out the sector, then that's also going to increase the number of pulses that are required. And if you increase your line density, how many pulses per arc across the screen that you have, then that also is going to increase your pulses per image and slow down your temporal resolution, or slow down your frame rate. Okay, now I'm going to go into some more detail on these different these different techniques that involve focusing, sector size, and things that affect the frame rate. And some of this is not necessarily in the book, but let's just go over it real quick. So when we utilize multiple foci, the machine will automatically select different sizes of aperture for where we want our focus. And so when we have multiple focus, it often will take a large aperture and then refocus it at multiple points, sending out pulses for each one, and creating different focal zones that are then averaged together to create the image. So this will slow down our frame rate because we're having to send multiple pulses and wait for the echoes to come back. So here's a description we see in transmission, wrong button, transmission zone 1. The focus initially is very close to the transducer. These little squares on the left represent the transducer, the subcrystals within the transducer. And so we'll focus once in the very close to it. I shouldn't say near field because the near field changes, but we'll focus once very close to the transducer and get this section use this section of the focus for the near field, or the near tissues, and then for the deeper tissues we'll send out another pulse that is focused deeper and utilize the reflections that come back from there for our for creating our image. And you can see that because it takes two pulses to create two different transmission focal zones, it's going to require twice as long as if we used one. So how does sector size work? Sector size is very simple. If we are looking at a small area that we need to look at, it's not going to take long to send pulses across there and collect information for it. If we're looking at a much larger area, then we have to send many more pulses across, and it's going to take us a lot longer to create an image where we have to scan over a wider area. And then the final thing to look at is line density. And line density is how close together our pulses are sent. So if we have lines that are very, very close together, we can separate in the lateral resolution objects that are somewhat closer together. If we don't have quite as many pulses going across our screen, then if we have two objects, then they only appear as one single pulse. And so line density is certainly going to affect lateral resolution. Okay, and you can actually tell, an important point here is that you can actually tell that our lateral resolution is going to become worse with any kind of sector or curvilinear probe as we get farther away from the transducer, because these lines are spreading out more as we get farther away. So our lateral resolution always degrades with a curved or sector probe in the far field. So temporal resolution and image quality, we would love to have beautiful image quality, and we'd love to have high temporal resolution, but we don't get that. Improving the image quality almost always decreases temporal resolution. So increased quality equals decreased frame rate. There is always a trade-off between temporal resolution and image quality. You just simply can't have it both ways. So in summary, the higher your frame rate, the better the temporal resolution. If you have a single focus, better temporal resolution. If you're using shallow imaging, you're going to have better temporal resolution. Narrow sectors, low line density improves the real-time visualization of the scan. If we lower our frame rate, well, what causes a lower frame rate is multifoci in transmit focus, deeper imaging, wide sector, and higher line density. Some of these things we cannot control. We can't really control if we have to image deeper. We have to image deeper. Often we can't control our sector width because we need to see as much as possible. We often can control the multifocus, but sometimes the image gets so bad that it's not worth it. So we just have the patient hold their breath longer. So again, there's always a trade-off, and it's very important to know what's going to make a higher frame rate or lower frame rate, and what's going to improve image quality. And that concludes the presentation for this chapter.